Pope Francis was the first leader elected to the Vatican from outside Europe in 1,300 years. He stood in opposition to traditional structures. He emphasized that it is the soul, not the body, that commits sin. He was not a figure who fit into the hegemonic order of the Vatican. He frequently clashed with conservative cardinals. Because he took sides with the marginalized in society, some labeled him a, quote, communist pope. His death caused widespread grief across the world, and his funeral was watched with great interest. After his passing, he received both prayers filled with praise and harsh criticism. So was Pope Francis really a communist? Do you know who he was and what he actually did? Let's take a brief look together. Pope Francis was born in 1936 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His birth name was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Both his mother's and father's families were Italian immigrants. However, Bergoglio was shaped by both his family's and Latin America's culture. For example, like every Argentinian, soccer was an important part of his life. He was a devoted fan of the San Lorenzo club and always followed the match results closely. He listened to tango music and loved to dance. In his youth, he worked as a chemical technician. He later turned to religious education and joined the Jesuit order. He became a priest in 1969 and served in the church for many years. In the 1970s, during Argentina's military dictatorship, he was the head of the Jesuits. During that period, around 30,000 people, including several priests, were killed by the military regime. However, many criticized him for not doing enough to save the priests or for not supporting the labor movements. The truth is, Francis expressed regrets and sorrow about his past. This state of reflection led him to build closer ties with the poor. In 1998, he was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires. During his priesthood, he lived in the slums of Argentina. In the diocese where he served, he reduced church expenditures and redirected resources to the poor. That's why he became known as the Slum Bishop. In 2001, he was made a cardinal. He became known for his care for the poor, migrants, and the marginalized sectors of society. In 2013, after Benedict's resignation, Pope Francis was elected by the Vatican as the new leader of the Catholic world. For the first time in 13 centuries, someone from outside Europe had become pope. I don't know how much his Italian roots influenced his election, but everyone understood that this marked a turning point in church history. From the moment he was elected, there was an expectation of change. Above all, he belonged to the Jesuit order. This was not just a break from tradition. It was also a political shift. The Jesuits are a community that takes vows of poverty, obedience, and simplicity. Staying true to that tradition, Francis rejected the palace-like splendor of the Vatican. Although he came from a merchant family in Italy, he took the name of Saint Francis of Assisi, who had chosen poverty. He became the first pope to adopt the name Francis. Instead of ornate crosses, embellished robes, or regal titles, he chose a modest way of life. He believed the church should be humble and free from extravagance, and that it should remain close to the poor. He would say, "The church is not a palace. If we are to follow the path of Christ, we must be modest and simple." This approach remained consistent throughout his papacy. Behind this perspective was not only his Jesuit formation, but also an ideological stance. Francis leaned toward Latin America's liberation theology. After meeting with Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez, he openly supported liberation theology. He embraced the slogan, "A poor church for the poor." He openly criticized capitalism and social injustice. For this reason, some conservative clergy labeled him a communist pope. Some even went so far as to say he might be the Antichrist. In that sense, it's fitting to say, a man who had taken a vow of poverty came to lead one of the world's richest institutions. After being elected, he refused to receive a salary and redirected it to charitable organizations. He did not move into the apostolic palace, but instead chose to live in the Santa Marta guest house. He did not present himself as God's voice on earth. Rather, he consistently described himself as a humble sinner. He frequently asked his followers to pray for him. He emphasized that it is the soul, not the body, that commits sin. This attitude became a guiding principle in both his religious and social views. He tried to develop a more inclusive approach toward women, homosexuals, migrants, and other marginalized groups. But this approach had its own limitations and contradictions. I will try to touch on each one as much as I can. Francis also took a clear stance on the issue of migrants. His first visit as Pope was to the Italian island of Lampedusa. During this visit, he drew attention to the deaths of migrants. He called on European countries not to close their doors. He also openly criticized the United States' policies of building walls and deporting refugees. During Donald Trump's presidency in particular, sharp tensions emerged between the Pope and the U.S. administration over anti-immigrant rhetoric. He stated that protecting refugees is a moral responsibility. He emphasized that the rights of all who suffer persecution must be defended, regardless of religion, ethnic identity, or sect. He opposed the idea of the Pope appearing as a privileged king. He openly stated that palace intrigues were still ongoing and that this system needed to end. The Pope's reform efforts faced strong internal resistance. Conservative cardinals opposed his desire for change. His initiatives were repeatedly blocked. The deeply rooted structure of the Vatican constantly limited his desire for reform. Yet despite all this, he managed to achieve many firsts and brought about significant changes. For example, he reorganized the ministries. He pursued corruption within the Vatican Bank and increased oversight. He tried to modernize and implement transparency in all of the Vatican's financial systems in accordance with European standards. He opened Vatican archives to secular courts. He helped mediate reconciliation, negotiations, and agreements in various countries. He consistently drew attention to poverty, inequality, and climate change. He also tackled one of the Vatican's most persistent crises, the issue of abuse and misconduct. Investigations on this matter were initially slow, and at first, the Pope appeared to be on the same side as the perpetrators. The families of the victims and the public said that the Pope was not decisive enough, and that he was not using the full extent of his authority. Francis invited them to the Vatican, acknowledged the criticism, and apologized. As a result, he initiated investigations in various countries and had many priests and bishops who had abused children removed from office. However, considering the history and practices of the Church, I believe the most significant changes Francis made were expanding space for women and adopting a more tolerant tone toward the LGBTIQ+ community. Francis had positions on women that diverged from the Vatican's traditional views. He wanted to open the way for women to take on greater responsibilities. He appointed many women to both the religious and administrative leadership of the Vatican. Although Francis represented a positive shift from his predecessors in matters related to women, he frequently opposed the concept of gender and used patriarchal language when speaking about women. For example, during a visit to the University of Louvain, Francis said, "Woman is more important than man, but for a woman to want to become a man is bad. And a woman within the people of God is a girl, a sister, a mother." He also maintained the Church's traditional stance on abortion and defined it as murder. He compared the act of abortion to hiring a hitman to solve a problem. Still, he said women who undergo abortion should be forgiven. He also opposed surrogacy and argued that it is not a right. Francis argued that groups marginalized by society should be more accepted within the Church, emphasizing that it is the soul, not the body, that commits sin. He insisted that no one should be excluded because of their gender, identity, or social status. Especially regarding gay individuals, he adopted a more inclusive tone compared to the Church's historical rhetoric, stating, "God loves homosexual people too. It is not a crime. Everyone should be welcomed in the Church." However, this softened tone did not entirely erase his earlier harsher remarks. As Archbishop in Argentina, Bergoglio openly opposed the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2010, calling the legislation the devil's plan. Then President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner responded harshly, describing his stance as medieval thinking. But in a surprising shift, during his first papal press conference in 2013, Francis said, "If a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge?" After becoming Pope, Bergoglio began expressing support for civil unions between same-sex couples. Throughout his papacy, he frequently made statements in support of the LGBTIQ+ community and even met with them. However, he maintained the Church's traditional stance on religious marriage. In a documentary released in 2020, he stated that homosexual individuals have the right to form a family and the state should protect them legally.
Somos todos hijos de Dios. Y Dios nos quiere como estamos y con la fuerza que luchamos cada uno por nuestra dignidad. El ser homosexual no es un delito. No es un delito. Sí, pero es pecado. Bueno, primero, distingamos pecado por delito. Pero también es pecado la falta de caridad con el prójimo. ¿Y vos cómo andás?
These statements gave hope to marginalized individuals on one hand, while also drawing criticism from conservative factions within the Church. As in many other areas, Francis often felt the need to clarify his earlier comments. His approach has generally been interpreted as an effort to oppose social exclusion, while still preserving doctrinal boundaries. Francis pursued a path of dialogue not only between Christian churches, but also with Muslims and Jews. One of the most defining aspects of his character was his calls for interfaith dialogue. In this spirit, he questioned the practices of the past and tried to approach contemporary issues in a more inclusive manner. Francis criticized the Crusades, deliberately orchestrated assimilation policies, and the colonial histories of states, placing strong emphasis on confronting them. During his papacy, the doctrine of discovery, which had been used since the 15th century to justify colonialism with religious foundations, was formally repudiated. This doctrine provided a religious rationale for the seizure of indigenous lands under the notion of a right of conquest. Francis openly condemned this tradition. He became known as the Pope, who apologized for the past more than any of his predecessors. In Turkey, he was criticized by some circles for referring to the 1915 Armenian genocide explicitly as genocide. He also stated that the mass killings of Catholic and Orthodox Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, and Greeks, alongside the Armenians, the first Christian nation, during the early 20th century by the Kemalist regime in Anatolia, was one of the three major tragedies of the century. Francis also clearly demonstrated his solidarity with peoples who continue to suffer injustice today. In Kurdistan, he commemorated the Yazidis who were subjected to genocide by ISIS. He condemned the 2015 attack on the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris. He said no one can kill in the name of religion, and murder in the name of God is a deviation from religion. These words were meant to remind people of the shared responsibility of all faiths, not just the Christian one.
La guerra es una papacia.
In his view, religion should never be used as a justification for violence. He did not remain silent in the face of the wars in the Middle East. He frequently criticized the 2003 Iraq War. US President George W. Bush's description of the invasion as a new crusade drew harsh reaction from the Pope. He found this language dangerous and destructive for the peoples of the region. He highlighted that Christian populations in the Middle East had been nearly wiped out, with 2/3 of Iraq's Christian population forced to emigrate. In 2016, he met with Patriarch Kirill, leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, in Cuba. This meeting marked a significant step toward healing a nearly 900-year-old schism between the two churches. Choosing Cuba as the meeting location symbolized his focus on the geography of the oppressed. He had previously visited Havana, where he was greeted by the Cuban Communist Party and posters of Che Guevara. In 2019, he visited the United Arab Emirates, becoming the first pope to travel to the Arab world. He signed the Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together with Sheikh Ahmed El-Tayeb of Al-Azhar. In 2021, Francis made a historic visit to Iraq. He visited the Kurdistan region and the ancient city of Ur, believed to be the birthplace of Abraham. There, he prayed with Muslims, Christians, and Yazidis, saying, "We are all children of Abraham." In Najaf, he met with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the Shiite religious leader. By establishing dialogue with both Sunni and Shiite leaders, he sought to contribute to intersectarian understanding. He also brought attention to the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system in Canada, where, until the late 20th century, Indigenous children were taken from their families and subjected to assimilation policies. In 2022, during a visit to Canada, he He apologized to the indigenous peoples and referred to this practice as a form of genocide. Francis declared days of fasting for global peace on many occasions. He called on world leaders to initiate a, quote, revolution of mercy. However, these calls often failed to receive political responses. Some argued that the Vatican had not used its influence effectively enough to promote peace. Despite all these efforts, Francis could not stop the wars, but he did show greater sensitivity and openness than his predecessors. He tried to defend the rights of all who were persecuted. Francis, throughout his papacy, he repeatedly called for global peace and criticized the power interests behind wars. However, he did not possess the political power to stop these conflicts. For this reason, he was sometimes criticized for being ineffective. He also did not remain silent on genocides and mass atrocities. He acknowledged and condemned the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. He reminded the world of the massacres in Cambodia, Rwanda, Burundi, and Bosnia, stressing that these tragedies should not be forgotten. In the final years of his tenure, he took a clear stance on the Palestinian issue. He criticized Israel's military operations in Gaza. After the attacks that began on October 7, 2023, he described what was happening in Gaza as genocide. He also noted the rapid decline of the Christian population in Palestinian territories. After Israel declared Jerusalem its undivided capital, the Vatican's stance toward Israel became more critical. The Pope called on the international community to take responsibility for the humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. He consistently called for a ceasefire. "I pray every day for peace in Palestine and Israel," he said. He tried to be a voice not just for Christians, but for all people suffering due to war. Regardless of sect, religion, or nationality, he expressed solidarity with every victim. He described the conflicts in the Middle East as a world war fought in fragments. He pointed to the arms trade as the real power behind these wars. Because of these positions, Hamas and Hezbollah praised Pope Francis. His recognition of the Palestinian state and condemnation of war crimes in Gaza were welcomed in these circles. In contrast, he was criticized by those who supported the actions labeled as genocide. Yet Pope Francis did not waver from standing on the side of the oppressed. Francis was a reformer, a voice for the oppressed, and someone who stood firmly on moral ground. But did he manage to transform the Vatican, the very institution he once called a palace of intrigue, as much as he hoped? The short answer is yes, because he implemented many reforms and achieved historic firsts. Still, how lasting his efforts will be, and how much the Vatican has truly changed, remains to be seen. Because even though Francis will be remembered as a papal figure who broke with tradition, most of his impact came through practical reforms rather than doctrinal changes. On the other hand, his courage in confronting oppressive and colonial pasts, his work for world peace, his compassion toward marginalized communities, and his sincere dialogue with other faiths deserve recognition. It shows us something important. Even an institution as ancient, powerful, and wealthy as the Vatican eventually has to adapt to scientific and modern changes. Because life demands it. Either you change or you disappear. Now let's briefly answer the question. Was Pope Francis really a communist? Not exactly. In fact, the conservative circles that called him a communist used the term not as an ideological classification, but as an insult. Francis always pursued a reformist path. He criticized capitalism and consumerism. He questioned the West's global arrogance. He even described Europe as an aging and weary continent. He argued that the world needs to reconsider concepts like justice, compassion, and mercy. But none of that necessarily makes someone a communist. Being a communist means advocating for and fighting to establish communism. Francis's sharp critiques of poverty, migration, and income inequality were labeled by some right-wing politicians and media as communist rhetoric, to which he replied, "If speaking about the poor makes me a communist, then the gospel is communist too." But politically, Francis was not a revolutionary. He was a reformer. He didn't want to overthrow the world order, but to improve it. A more humane, compassionate, and just world. And you don't have to be a communist to want that. At the same time, even though he envisioned a poor church for the poor, he didn't explicitly target the pillars of capitalism, the exploitation of labor, the banking system, privatization, institutions like the IMF, or patriarchal culture. He empathized with the poor, listened to their suffering, and voiced their concerns loudly, but he did not sever ties with the producers of poverty. He even met with leaders who manage global capital. And let's not forget, the Vatican remains one of the wealthiest landowners in the world. One thing is clear. For better or worse, Francis was full of contradictions. As a result, he drew heavy criticism, too progressive for conservatives, and not progressive enough for progressives. As the Church now looks to the future and the one who will take his place, there is one undeniable fact. Pope Francis changed the papacy forever. Not just through his words, but through where he stood and the paths he chose. One day before his death, during the Easter Vigil, he shared his final message. He drew attention to the death and destruction caused by the conflict in Gaza, called for a ceasefire, release the hostages, and help those who are starving and longing for a peaceful future.